Welcome back to the last afternoon. The first plenary session is on reflections and evaluation of COP27. Our first speaker is Nate HULTMAN. He's the founder and director of the Center for Global Sustainability at University of Maryland and professor in the School of Public Policy. He was recently senior advisor for the special presidential envoy for climate at the US State Department. And he's also the associate director for the Joint Global Change Research Institute.
Okay, well, hope everybody's feeling energized after the lunch and the morning sessions. And it's great to be able to be here again in the community discussing COP27 outcomes. So I was at the COP. I know probably at least a number of you in the audience were probably also at the COP in at least for some time. Let me start because we have two people going today, and I'll sort of start by maybe framing up a little bit of what was discussed and what were the outcomes with a little bit of editorial comment on that. We do have some, Vicki Pollard will go after me, and then we'll have some Q&A time, and I think would try to keep a little bit of time for us to have that open discussion. So first of all, the COPs. I think it's really important as we think about the COPs to remember that each individual COP is not the kind of single make or break moment for the global climate. I think all of us probably following this for a long time know this in a fundamental sense, but every year I get, and probably some people do as well, panicky calls from reporters asking, what happened at the COP? Does this mean everything's falling apart? And how do we interpret this? My kind of way to think about this is we think about the COPs usually in a cluster of like 3 or so. I don't know. That's just a number I picked. Where last year we had Glasgow, this year we had COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt, and next year we'll have COP29, which is the global stocktake year. And I think it's good to think about them in a pattern as to what happens for each one. So that's kind of one comment, and I'll get back to that in a minute. This COP27, I think was quite I think in contrast to Glasgow, which I felt was largely a sort of set of really good and in some cases surprisingly good outcomes, I think COP27 was frankly more of a mixed bag, and there were a lot of ways in which the conversation was either in great danger of regressing and sort of falling apart, or even to some degree did so at least partially. But then some outcomes were salvaged. I think that it's important to remember too at the COP that there are really two sides of the COP. As my former colleague at the State Department, Subiniaz, likes to call it, there's like the big COP and the little COP, like the big C COP and the little C COP. And in her view, the little C COP, even though she's a negotiator, is the negotiations. It's the legal discussions around the Framework Convention process about what the countries are going to agree to as part of the formal agenda. And then there's the big COP, which is all of the other stuff that also happens at the same moment with all the same players kind of working together, discussing things with each other and beyond. So the COP is both a moment that sort of forces action globally, and it's also a set of negotiations that has its kind of sort of internal logic and outcomes. And sometimes I think it's important to remember to keep both of those in mind as we're kind of assessing what happened and thinking about where the bright spots were and where the weaknesses were in each one. So I think COP27 is a good example of that. In terms of the little COP, the kind of negotiations track COP, it was a kind of tough agenda. It was adaptation, finance, loss and damage, and to some degree, a little bit of ambition, but that was really not that front and center. It was sort of build the implementation COP, but really those other 3 items were dominant, particularly something called loss and damage, which is fundamentally about the question of how arguably the developed countries compensate countries that are being impacted by climate damages. And that is a very fraught, difficult conversation. There's a lot of normative values, disagreements about how we should think about that, how that should be framed up. There's a lot of legal liability questions. So it's always been hard, and it came to the front this year, and it was not an easy conversation, but an outcome was agreed to, which I'm happy to speak a little bit more to if people want. In terms of, and that's in some ways, that was kind of the little COP outcome. I would say that in terms of like what's tracking from that to the next year, it's really tracking towards something that I think a lot of you are familiar with called the global stocktake. And this group has really been feeding into a lot of the analysis and insight that will be used to support understanding of the big question of the next 12 months, which is, are we on track to 1.5? I think we all know the answer to that. It's either no or not yet, depending on your kind of perspective on it. And so that'll be a kind of very important next step out of COP27, which I think will refocus on ambition. And my own view is that that's going to be a good thing. The other thing I'll just put on the table before I wrap is the other stuff, the non-negotiations track part of the COP. And this is where I also think that, frankly, more progress was visible and relevant in terms of national ambition. You know, last year at Glasgow, countries had agreed that countries would revisit their NDCs, their formal commitments, and come back to COP27 with revised targets, ideally revised NDCs if they could. And frankly, most countries did not do that. But I do note that Mexico and particularly Indonesia did come out as a result of not just their own internal processes, but as a result of very deliberate engagement with, like I mentioned, I think on the first day of this session, engagement with G7 countries, you know, deploying new kinds of finance from the current financial architecture, including the multilateral development banks, and of course, direct bilateral finance from a number of countries to enable those countries to put much more ambitious goals on the table than they had done before. A second item that I think is worth noting is methane. Methane came into kind of focus really strongly, I think, last year with the Global Methane Pledge, which countries signed up to commit to a collective 30% reduction by 2030. As of last year, I think there were 110 countries. As of this year, there are now 150 countries representing over 50% of global emissions in the Global Methane Pledge. And recognizing that that particular commitment is pretty weak in terms of any individual country's action, I think it's very effectively put on the agenda globally the fact that methane and other non-CO2s are really important for countries to be considering. And I would hope and expect that we will see more action on specifically non-CO2s. And I would even argue as a result of the Global Methane Pledge, that's another area of work that this community can be very, very helpful in helping collectively to understand, but also various national governments to understand. And finally, there was a renewed discussion between the world's top two emitters, between China and the United States, on potential work that they could do together. I was involved in that last year with the Kerry team and got involved with some of our team this year in a capacity to support that work as well. And I think that that's promising, but didn't directly lead to any real agreement or commitment at the COP. But I'm hoping over the course of the next maybe few months, there might be some more to report on that. Maybe with that, I will stop and we can hand over to our next speaker.
Thanks, Nate. So our next speaker is Vicki Pollard. She's worked on climate change for the European Commission since 2006. She's currently the head of the unit in the Commission's Directorate General for Climate Action. And she was the counselor for environment and climate at the EU's delegation to China in Beijing. Thanks for joining us, Vicki.
Thanks. Thank you very much to both of you. And I hope that you can hear me okay over there. It's a pleasure to join you from Brussels, although Brussels is very subdued tonight. We had some not so great news from the World Cup tonight. I just want to check that you can see this properly without any interference. I'm going to just try a trick.
We can see it now.
And you're not seeing a grey bar across the top? No. So maybe what I wanted to do first of all is just talk you through some of the objectives of the EU going into COP27. So for us, it was very important to maintain the political momentum on keeping the 1.5 degrees alive, as came out of the Glasgow COP in COP26. Also to set the expectation for all major economies to deliver on ambitious action. It was very important for us that the work programme on mitigation would actually lead to a scale up of mitigation action, but also implementation, which is critical this decade. But we also wanted to send a strong political signal on this commitment to strengthen the financial architecture for averting, minimizing and addressing loss and damage, but especially for the most vulnerable. And I won't go through the full list, but it gives you a sense of where we were going in. In terms of the outcomes, I think it's clear that the agreement on loss and damage was a historic outcome for this COP. It's important in terms of the new funding arrangements. It's important that it focuses particularly on the most vulnerable. Also very important that it looks at a mosaic of sources, funds and processes. So it expands the range of finance sources beyond focused on developed country public finance, and that's very important, I think, for the future. There's a lot more detail, but I won't go into it all now because we haven't got time. But I have to say that while it was a success in terms of the funding arrangements for the most vulnerable in terms of loss and damage, the COP outcomes on mitigation ambition were rather disappointing. For us, it was very important to address the gap between what the NDCs, both, and you can see here both the conditional and the unconditional NDCs will deliver, and what we need to do to get up to 1.5 degrees. This is featured ahead of a number of different COPs, and it's been very important in terms of pushing ambition. And this is we were hoping to do more on this year in COP27. But I have to say that on mitigation ambition, we were very disappointed. The lack of a clear path to 1.5 degrees or peaking of global emissions before 2025, or the phase out of unabated fossil fuels. These are things that we would have, we think are important in terms of ambition, and of course also in terms of reducing the need for loss and damage. The importance is that the decisions that the COP in Egypt hold the Glasgow line on the coal phase down and the phase down of fossil fuels, phase out of fossil fuel subsidies, and it calls on those who haven't done so to communicate new or NDCs or to update their NDCs, but it's not a call on all. And there is an element for a push to accelerate the uptake of renewables, but there was a very disappointing addition at the last minute, which was covered extensively in the news, I think, but there was a change to include low emission energy alongside renewables, and this has been criticised in terms of creating a loophole for gas. On the mitigation work programme, the COP27 also agreed the modalities for the mitigation work programme for urgently scaling up mitigation ambition and implementation. What it agrees to is 2 global dialogues per year, including with high-level champions, regional dialogues, but also investment-focused events. I think these are very important. Also, that that we will have the fact that we will have the ministerial dialogues every year means that it creates an appointment beyond the 5-year process with the global stocktake to look at increasing ambition, and this will last until 2026 at least. And as was just mentioned, the global stocktake is coming up, and in Sharm el Sheikh we had the 2nd technical dialogue, which was important in terms of being an inclusive process for parties and non-party stakeholders on how to bridge the gaps. It's going to be the work that comes out of the technical dialogues will feed into the COP28 that was synthesized, presented at COP 2023, the implications discussed and considered, and of course the aim there is to increase ambition. So looking forward, so just we have a brief summary of the main aspects. I haven't covered everything because we haven't got time, but of course there's also decisions on adaptation and on finance, which are also very important, but I won't go into the detail here. Looking forward to COP28. So COP28 will take place in the United Arab Emirates from the 30th of November to the 12th of December next year. In terms of the main features, there'll be a decision made on the progress on the mitigation work programme, and there will be the annual ministerial on the pre-2030 ambition. There will also be the political phase of the global stocktake, so the first global stocktake, and that will set the political expectations for the next round of NDCs. Also, conclusion of the work programme on global goals and adaptation, a decision regarding new funding arrangements, including the fund for loss and damage, as well as the selection, of course, of the host of the Santiago dialogue. So the COP28 is a really important moment, and I think in terms, just to conclude, in terms of what this means for the work of the IAMC community, I think what COP27 confirms again is just how important the modelling research is in terms of supporting policy and in supporting ambition, both in terms of the long-term strategies and the NDCs. How what we're seeing is a progressive shift from target setting to implementation. And I think it's particularly important to look at how research and modelling can support the implementation process, whilst at the same time keeping an eye on how country pledges evolve over time and whether they meet, they're moving in the right direction to meet the needs in terms of 1.5 degrees. Also, the ambitious mitigation work programme will lead to a need for short-term mitigation options and implementation opportunities information. And there, I think that's also a question for the research community in terms of how to translate model results into narrative, into information which can feed into that sort of shorter-term annual process to keep the policymakers informed. Also, as part of the decision, for the first time, there was some discussion on transition. There's a lot more focus on just transition, and I think in terms of the socio-economic aspects, angles from the modelling, I think would be very important moving forwards, because they're going to be very critical in terms of the implementation. And I think also what we see, and we've seen that since the last COP, as the previous speaker just pointed out, that what happens outside the Paris Agreement in terms of the pledges, talk about the methane pledge, but it's also the case on just transition, that these are also very important in terms of pushing ambition and promoting transition and helping countries move to implement their commitments. And with that, I wanted to stop so we can see a little bit of room for discussion. Thanks.
So thank you, Nate and Vicky, both. And now we have about 10 minutes for discussion. So if people have questions, feel free to come up to the microphones. And while we're waiting for people to come up, I'm going to ask a question that may have actually been answered by one of you, and I'm not sure. So the loss and damage fund, what is the process for implementing that, or process for deciding how to implement that?
I think Vicki should answer this one.
So basically, there's a work program set up, and there will be a decision next year on that at the COP in COP 28. And so the provisions, the sort of principles agreed this year, and the work will be intense over the next year to reach an agreement next year at COP 28 on the details for the fund.
Thank you.
Yeah, so my sense is that up to now, particularly, I mean, the U.S. is one of the sort of long, I don't want to call it holdouts, but signed on to this idea that there ought to be some kind of loss and damage facility, the details of which are still under discussion. And so there's differences of opinion as how that architecture can be stitched together, although there is generally a sense that there probably ought to be a way to do this. And that's, I think, what this process will lead to.
Thanks. I also know there's other people in the audience who were also at COP. So if anybody else has a reflect, go ahead. You guys don't have to raise your hand. You can just walk up to the microphone.
David McCollum, Oak Ridge National Lab. Yeah, I actually on this question of loss and damage, I mean, and then thinking back to the folks here, what would be the timeline that we could think about trying to model scenarios that could inform that discussion? And even have you had any thoughts even in the last couple of weeks about what sort of science is needed to inform that debate, and how could that be done?
I have to say that that's quite a tough question for me. I'm actually not the expert in loss and damage, so it's very hard for me to answer that question. And I guess I would send that back to people in the room in terms of how do you feel that your models are ready to answer the questions, and do we, in terms of the modeling capacity for those countries, the most vulnerable countries that we're looking at, what is needed to for the modeling to be able to develop the information base that will help implement loss and damage. Because I think that we are talking about the most vulnerable countries. But for me, obviously, what we're looking at in terms of loss and damage is actually avoiding the need for loss and damage. So already a lot of the work that's happening in terms of ambition is important, but of course, we know we need that's not going to be sufficient. So in terms of the scale of the funding needed, I'm interested also in terms of the views from the room.
Yeah, let me just agree with that point, that to some degree, that's a good topic for people to hear, to start thinking about, of what is the opportunity and the role of this community's insights in informing those conversations. I'll echo a comment that I know we heard earlier in the conference, which is that a lot of the loss and damage discussion will be around specific localities and specific countries, and so that again gets back to the question of understanding that relationship. To some degree, I also think that it's probably going to be really hard to parse out, climate impact versus just bad weather events. And I think there's going to be a hard, there's going to be some fuzzy boundaries there that people have to start thinking about what is going to be really in scope for this kind of a mechanism. And I think that's part of the general problem of this mechanism in the beginning, but it's not that it can't be worked through in some way. I'm going to just pick up on a brief comment that Vicki made at the very end, which is to say not to lose sight of the ambition part of the discussion as we think about loss and damage. And so to pivot just to that very briefly, in Vicki's slides, there was a very nice summary slide And it did note, and I'm going to go back to this point because I think it's quite important for us as this community. This next year of the global stocktake, as Vicki noted, is a quote political moment. And I think that's really important. Like there's the negotiations track, but the global stocktake will become a political moment. And what that means is that there will be a bright light shining on overall ambition globally, on specific opportunities to enhance ambition globally, but that will refract immediately into opportunities to enhance ambition in national and other kinds of contexts. And I think it will be very important for us as a community to be out there very early, for those of us who feel so inclined, by the way, not everybody wants to do this, but like to be out there and to be discussing those kinds of truths of what needs to happen and where. And I will, for example, say that, look, there are a lot of countries that are very helpfully trying to think about reducing their emissions, and that is important. But there's also a set of countries which we can sort of argue is really just the G20, whose emissions really matter the most to get us onto 1.5. And it's going to be critically important to have good, clear, transparent understanding about where those countries are going, what they could do more, and how they might accomplish that. Because right now, if you look at what's actually been committed to in the context of the Paris architecture, meaning the NDCs and the long-term targets, we're not close to being there in terms of actual formally announced targets. And so that process is going to be one that does fundamentally depend on insights from this community. And I think it's a really important thing for us to be out there and sort of making that case clearly as to what needs to happen. Not just we're off track, we all know that, but like, how do we get on track if we're ever going to do it? And that to be focusing on, yes, a lot of this is about sort of some of the key emitters that are all, you know, the top 20 or 25 or whatever. That's my own take on it, by the way. Not everybody has to agree on that, but just sort of that's kind of how I think about this. But anyway, let me end there.
We have time for one more question. Somebody.
Let's get both.
Okay, yeah,
we have both come, just both of you.
You want to
I make a very short question.
Yeah.
Christoph Bertram from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. So my question would be, following up on your comments, Nate, on the opportunities, kind of how would kind of the current fossil energy price increases be kind of an opportunity that, especially for the European case, could be a case for like increased ambition in the near term to really achieve the peak?
Yeah, just go ahead and ask the next question.
Yeah, thank you. I want to pick up the point, Nate, you mentioned in the end about the China and the United States re-engaging the climate talks. What do you see as the important and promising areas for these two countries to collaborate now, since the world has changed so much, good and bad, in the past few years? Thank you.
So maybe if you each want to, yeah, Vicki, do you want to take that sounds good. Yeah, so Vicki, if you want to take the first one on fossil prices.
Okay. On high fossil fuel prices, what we see in Europe is that we have a plan adopted, proposed by the Commission, and in discussion now by the member states and Parliament, called the Repower Plan, which is a response to the war in Ukraine and the high fossil fuel prices. What it shows is that the fact that we have legislation, the Fit for 55 package, to get us to our climate target puts us in a much stronger position in terms of energy security and the strength of our economy. So the high fossil fuel prices actually call for an acceleration of action. It's the case for the EU, but I think it's the case for many other parties around the world. What we see also, there are some figures, for example, there's some quarterly greenhouse gas emissions figures for the Netherlands. The figures published for the first quarter of 2022 show, for example, that in the Netherlands, there was a very large increase in energy efficiency, so a big reduction in consumption by consumers in a reaction to the high fossil fuel prices. So there's I think it is triggering changes in behavior. It's raising awareness. It's increasing the speed at which energy efficiency measures, renewable energy measures will be taken up.
Thanks, Vicki. And Nate, do you want to real quickly take the last one?
Yeah, I'll do it real quick, but thanks, Wei, for the excellent question. And then that was actually part of the discussion at the COP of what the areas that could be worked on together. And I genuinely think there are a lot of areas that we could work on together, US and China, with input from international partners in various ways. I think it's critically important for us to do this work together and to kind of socialize the idea about more ambitious pathways being possible in both the US and China. So power sector decarbonization is critical. We all know that. We know how. It's renewables, coal, and efficiency in some combination. And let's think about those, including grid management, methane in lots of different ways, inventories, mitigation technologies, and projections, because projections are critically important here too. Circular economy, an area that hasn't been as much picked up in the US, but is really interesting in China and Europe. And I think the US can learn some things from that. And I think is a good opportunity to engage between US and China. EVs and EV deployment, very important. You know, some people here have been doing work on that. Lots that we, I think, know about with that. Building sector. And then finally, one thing that I think would be interesting is actually better understanding the implications of the current policies in each country and how they aggregate together. China has something called a 1+N architecture. The US has, as I talked about the other day, a federal system, and understanding and communicating to the leaders in those countries what those diverse sort of layers of government and actions can do to get them to deliver faster and more will be actually something that I think both countries are interested in learning more about. So I would sort of start there, but maybe more to come, and input welcome.
I want to thank our speakers one more time.